Hi everyone, and welcome to the Sound Mind podcast, where we dive into the fascinating world of music psychology. I'm your host, Sophia, and as a music psychologist, I'll be guiding you through everything you've ever wondered about music. So, whether you're a music lover or just interested in the science of sound, you're in the right place. Now, when someone asks what kind of music you listen to, do you still answer with a genre? Or is it an artist? A vibe, even? See, genre used to be central to identity, but now people seem to answer with playlists, moods, or just vibes. So today, I want to discuss, do genres still matter in how we connect with music today? Or have they become obsolete? Let's talk about the history of music genres, their role in music, and how this has shifted as of recent. So, when we talk about music genres, what do we really mean? At its simplest, a genre is a conventional category that groups music together based on shared traditions or conventions. Now, it's important to note that genre is not the same as musical form or style. So, form refers to structure. So, think of like a sonata, for example. But style might point to a composer's or artist's fingerprint or historical period. So think about romantic, classical, or baroque. But genre, it sits in a different space. So it's more about socially recognized categories that we, as listeners and creators, agree upon. So, the musicologist Franco Fabri gave us one of the most influential definitions back in 1982. He described a genre as a set of musical events whose course is governed by a definite set of socially accepted rules. And what I love about this definition is that it highlights the dual nature of genres. So they're partly about the sound itself, the rhythms, the instruments, the harmonies, but equally about cultural expectations. Think about punk music, for example. It's not just fast guitars and raw vocals. It's ripped jeans, basement gigs, and anti-establishment energy. Genres carry both the sonic DNA and the cultural identity of the music. But historically, though, people didn't really use genres in the way that we do now. Music was usually categorized by its function or purpose. So you had religious music written for churches and rituals, courtly music played in palaces and noble settings, folk music that was tied to oral tradition and community life. The classification was much more about what the music was for rather than what it sounded like. And that began to shift in the early 19th century. So in 1810, the Swiss musicologist Heinrich Christoph Koch made the first major attempt to categorize music by genre. He proposed three primary categories: vocal, instrumental, and dance music. Pretty simple, right? Well, it was a simple framework, but it was revolutionary at the time because it moved the conversation from function to form and content. And this three-part system dominated musicology for much of the 19th century and really did set the stage for more detailed classifications later on. Now, the 20th century, however, completely changed the landscape. With the rise of recording technology, radio, and global distribution, the number of genres expanded at an unprecedented rate. Blues, jazz, country, rock, hip-hop, electronic music. Each of these didn't just emerge fully formed. They evolved, split into subgenres, and cross-pollinated with one another. So rock alone, it branched into psychedelic rock, punk rock, indie rock, metal, and countless more. It's crazy how we've gone from a handful of broad categories to literally thousands of microgenres today. But some musicologists actually argue that the very concept of genre is obsolete. They suggest that music has become too fluid, too hybrid, and too global to meaningfully be boxed into categories. And yet, genres refuse to disappear. they continue to evolve. New genres are still emerging, sometimes out of internet culture, like vaporwave or hyperpop, while older ones are constantly being redefined or remixed. So, why does genre persist? Well, it does serve a number of purposes. Genres act as recognizable frameworks. They set expectations for both listeners and creators. If you hit play on a lo-fi beats playlist, you know roughly what you're going to get. And genres also help to define communities and identities. So fans of metal or jazz or EDM, they often build not just listening habits, but entire subcultures like fashion, slang, even political values around their chosen genres. And on a cognitive level, genres help us organize and make sense of music. They act as shortcuts in our brains, making it easier to navigate this endless, almost ocean of sounds that we're exposed to today. And also, they're invaluable in music education and theory. So genres allow historians, teachers, and of course, researchers to categorize, compare, and trace the development of musical ideas over time. So, while genres may feel more fluid and less rigid than they once did, they do remain a central way that we interact with music. They're not just labels, they're living, evolving systems that bridge sound, society, and identity. Now, there's a pretty amazing resource for exploring the evolution of music genres, and that's one website called musicmap.info. So it was created by a Belgian architect, and Music Map is an interactive genealogy, really, of popular music genres from 1870 to, well, the way we know things today. It's been described as one of the internet's most extensive, detailed, and informative music encyclopedias. So the site features a dynamic map that illustrates the relationships and history of over 200 genres and subgenres. It's honestly super, super cool. You can click on any genre to read about its origins, influences, subgenres, and you can also listen to different tracks through playlists that are embedded on the website. Honestly, Music Map serves as both an educational tool but also a framework for music databases. It offers insights into the sociological and historical context of music genres. It's a super valuable resource for anyone interested in understanding this intricate web of musical evolution. So I 100% recommend you go and check it out. It's a really awesome website. Now, I know I've briefly gone into why music genres are still important, but I do want to talk about why they matter a little bit less in today's day and age. So, in the past, music genres have acted as clear, almost rigid labels. Think about rock, pop, jazz, hip hop. And these labels help listeners identify, categorize, and navigate the vast world of music that's out there. And these labels weren't just functional. Like I've said, they carried social meaning, they signaled communities, lifestyles, and cultural identities. But in today's digital and globalized music landscape, the relevance and rigidity of these traditional genres are actually rapidly diminishing. So let's talk a little bit about why. Starting off with the rise of music streaming platforms, which has fundamentally changed the way that we listen to and discover music. Services like Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube, and even TikTok use these complex recommendation algorithms that analyze everything from your listening history to skip rates, song structure, and playlist behaviors. And the result is that you're introduced to songs and artists across multiple genres. A listener who primarily streams indie rock may be recommended a Latin pop track, an experimental electronic piece, or even a hip hop remix, but all in the same playlist. So think about platforms like Spotify. They have their Discover Weekly or Apple Music's For You. They don't prioritize genre as the primary filter. They prioritize mood, tempo, and listening habits. And streaming algorithms encourage exploratory listening, which is increasing exposure to diverse musical styles and weakening the traditional boundaries that once separated genres. This means that listeners are now guided more by personal preferences, emotional resonance, and contextual suitability rather than these traditional genre categories. Playlists themselves are a cultural phenomenon that further diminish genre relevance. So think about curated playlists. They organize music by activity, mood, or emotional state, not whether the track is pop, rock, or jazz. And the emphasis is increasingly on how a song makes you feel, rather than the historical or structural category that it belongs to. My playlists are definitely an eclectic mix of genres that fit into certain moods or activities. So I totally get that. I definitely don't fit into one genre box. And I think the art of creating playlists, that's really part of it. It allows you to express yourself not into a rigid box, but exactly how you see that mood or that moment being expressed. I think about recent additions like Spotify's Daylist, which is a perfect example of how streaming platforms are reshaping how we discover and engage with music. So rather than organizing music by strict genres, Daylist curates songs based on the time of day, context, or activity, encouraging listeners to follow a mood or routine rather than a category. And it really highlights a broader trend in streaming culture. Playlists are no longer just collections of songs, but tools for shaping experiences and emotions. By prioritizing when or how music is consumed over what genre it belongs to, things like Daylist show how algorithms and curated playlists are guiding listening habits in a way that makes traditional genre labels less central to the listener experience. So, just pulling up my Daylist right now, for example. Today, it's Breakdown Gacha Gaming Tuesday afternoon. What does that mean? I have no idea, but it's way more shareable than a boring genre-listed playlist name, right? I mean, the virality of this is insane. And the description is, here's some breakdown, gacha gaming, slow pop, scream, western, bad mood, inspired by your listening on Tuesday in the afternoon. And I can click on each of these descriptors as if they were genres and receive a curated mix for each. I love it. Even if I don't understand it, I love it. And honestly, things like Spotify Wrapped as well, coming up with these crazy genre names and then giving a list of artists or moods that fall within them. It's another way of organizing music, and you also get these communities coming out of them. So I feel like there are just different ways to label things, whether that's a genre or something new that's kind of a genre, but is more just like a descriptor. Now, another factor contributing to the decreasing importance of genres is the blurring of musical boundaries by artists themselves. So now we're in the 21st century, cross-genre experimentation has become the norm rather than the exception. Artists are no longer constrained to a single category. Instead, they draw freely from this global palette of sounds and traditions. And so many artists today challenge listeners to think beyond conventional genre definitions. Think about Beyoncé releasing a country album, for example. That was like the shock of the century in itself. But more historical examples include Miles Davis, who integrated rock into jazz and created this jazz rock fusion genre, which influenced later bands. The Beatles, for example, they explored various genres and incorporated orchestral elements and different experimental techniques into popular music. David Bowie, he's a pioneer in challenging musical and identity norms through this continuous reinvention and genre blending. And of course, the king, Prince, he fused rock, funk, and blues. And the list goes on forever. But this trend of blurred boundaries is also super visible in industry practices, and it shows just how difficult it's become to categorize music in rigid ways. Music awards, charts, and even streaming metadata have struggled to keep pace with the rapid evolution of genres. So, take the Grammy Awards, for example. Over the past decade, they've had to create new categories, such as Best Urban Contemporary Album or Best Global Music Album, to account for these hybrid sounds that don't fit neatly into traditional boxes like pop or R&B. And even so, there's debate over where an artist belongs, and many albums end up being nominated in multiple categories because they straddle stylistic lines. Similarly, music charts, which were once strictly divided by genre, have become more fluid as well. So, Billboard, for instance, they now maintain multiple charts for the same song depending on format, radio play, and streaming. So, a single track can appear on the Hot 100, the R&B hip hop chart, and the pop song charts simultaneously. And this reflects the reality that listeners themselves are consuming music in ways that almost ignore genre boundaries, making traditional classification increasingly irrelevant. And even streaming platforms are facing similar challenges. So metadata, which was originally designed to help organize songs by artist, album, and genre, now often includes multiple genre tags or even these mood and theme categories. So, for example, a track by Lil Nas X might be tagged as pop, country, hip hop, and dance all at once. And platforms like Spotify and Apple Music also rely on algorithmic classification that prioritizes user behavior and playlist context over these fixed genre labels. And as a result, the industry itself is essentially acknowledging that the old boundaries are breaking down and new, more fluid ways of organizing music are necessary. Younger generations, particularly Gen Z, have embraced a radically different approach to music. So they often describe music not by genre, but by vibe, mood, or situation. So instead of saying, for example, I listen to jazz music, they might just say, I need something chill to focus to, or give me a hype song for working out. And social media platforms like TikTok amplify this trend. Songs become popular based on trends, challenges, or emotional resonance, rather than their genre classification. So, for instance, a song that goes viral as a dance challenge may be labeled as pop by the algorithm, but the audience's association with it is the feeling or activity, not actually the genre. So I did a whole episode actually on TikTok and short form content and its role in music, so do check that out if you're interested. But overall, this really represents a cultural shift in music consumption. And I think that's the most fascinating part, to actually be part of this movement and witness it happening in front of our eyes. So, research shows that younger listeners prioritize emotional connection and contextual relevance over traditional stylistic markers. So, in other words, music is becoming personalized, situational, and, well, fluid, reflecting how people live their everyday lives rather than historical genre categories. And globalization has also played a massive role in reducing the dominance of traditional genres. Today, music travels faster and further than ever before. Genres once considered regional, such as K-pop, Afrobeats, or reggaeton, now have international audiences, collaborations, and influence. And cross-cultural collaborations are now commonplace. For example, South Korean artists work with American producers, African musicians collaborate with Latin artists, and electronic music producers sample sounds from across the globe. And these interactions create hybrid genres that are quite difficult, if not impossible, to classify more strictly. And global music consumption patterns also reflect this fluidity. So a listener in, New York might stream Afrobeats, K-pop, and trap music all in a single evening without even thinking about genres at all. And honestly, that sounds like me. The evolution of genres is web-like rather than linear, I would say, and with influences crossing continents, decades, and cultural boundaries, this is more visible now than ever. This globalization contributes to the blurring of old boundaries, further diminishing the authority of genre as a useful descriptor. So I guess we should come back to the central question here, which is, do genres still matter? And even though we've seen how genres are becoming less central in today's extremely streaming-driven, globalized, and algorithmically curated music landscape, that doesn't mean that they've disappeared entirely. In fact, genres continue to matter in several important ways, I would say, for artists, the music industry, and even listeners themselves. So first off, even in a world where genres are becoming more fluid, they still play an important psychological and emotional role for listeners. Genres actually act as a kind of shortcut, helping us anticipate the mood, energy, or emotional arc of a song before it even begins. For example, a listener might expect metal to energize, jazz to relax, or R&B to evoke intimacy and reflection. And these expectations, they're not arbitrary. They're built on repeated exposure to musical patterns and these conventions that exist within each genre. And from a music psych perspective, this predictability can create comfort and satisfaction. So familiar patterns, chord progressions, instrumentation, and rhythms allow listeners to quickly interpret the emotional content of the music, actually reducing cognitive load. In other words, genres help us navigate the vast landscape of music a bit more efficiently. Now, research shows that when listeners can anticipate elements of a song, it actually enhances engagement, emotional resonance, and even memory for the music. This cognitive function explains why genres still matter on a personal level, even when streaming platforms, algorithms, and these hybrid styles seem to blur the more traditional boundaries. They are more than labels, they're tools for emotional prediction and musical orientation, allowing us to find music that fits not just a moment or activity, but also a desired emotional experience. Now, for artists and the music industry, genres remain a practical framework for organizing, promoting, and recognizing music. So awards such as the Grammys, they still rely heavily on genre categories to determine eligibility, submissions, and highlight artistic achievement. So categories like Best Rock Album, Best Jazz Vocal Album, or Best Latin Pop Album may seem straightforward, but they do serve as more than just labels. They provide structure to such a vast and diverse musical ecosystem. Yet even in this system, modern music often defies rigid categorization. As we've established, many artists today produce music that blends multiple styles, resulting in albums that are nominated across several categories, which challenges the very notion of single genre classification. And similarly, music charts and streaming platforms also rely on genre tags to organize the vast number of songs available and to help the industry target audiences effectively. So Billboard, for example, like I mentioned, they place single songs on multiple charts depending on the listening context. And this reflects both the hybrid nature of contemporary music, but also the practical necessity of maintaining some kind of organizational structure. Now, research in cultural studies actually highlights this. So, despite the fluidity of music consumption today, genres do remain an efficient shorthand for record labels, marketers, and playlist curators, allowing them to communicate style, mood, and target demographics to audiences efficiently. Genres also continue to play a crucial role for listeners, especially within dedicated fan communities. So while many casual listeners may now prioritize mood or vibes over formal categorization, some communities maintain a strong attachment to genres as part of their identity. So you've got metalheads, punk enthusiasts, rap fans, which often engage with the genre as a whole lifestyle, incorporating not just the music itself, but also fashion, cultural norms, aesthetic values, and even social practices into their identity. And these communities create spaces of shared meaning and social connection, providing listeners with a sense of belonging that extends beyond just mere musical preference. And sociological research supports this, showing that genre-based communities offer cultural and social cohesion, where music share not only taste but also values and worldviews. Even in an era of genre-fluid playlists and cross-cultural collaborations, these communities demonstrate that genres can remain powerful symbols of identity, authenticity, and belonging. But like I mentioned, genres also continue to function as practical navigational tools for listeners. Even these hybrid or genre-crossing tracks, they're often understood relative to the genres that they draw from, giving listeners reference points for what to expect sonically and emotionally. Now, one really important point to highlight here is that genres also preserve cultural memory and historical context, which is another way that they continue to matter. Understanding a piece of music as jazz, blues, or reggae connects it to a lineage of conventions, influences, and this socio-cultural history. And this is critical for music education, where genres provide structured ways to teach musical forms and histories, as well as for music journalism and criticism, where genres help articulate trends, innovation, and influence. Genres also allow historians and researchers to track the evolution of musical styles, cultural exchange, and the social forces that shape sound over time. Even as music becomes more hybridized, genres act as scaffolds that allow listeners, critics, and scholars to interpret music in this broader context. And also, I think it's important to not detach such genres from their history. They've really fought a crazy battle to be where they are today. When I think about genres like jazz and blues and how much they've evolved and the political and cultural significance of them. So I believe that taking away those labels may do more harm than good. So, in essence, genres may no longer dominate listening habits or dictate cultural consumption as rigidly as they once did, but they continue to serve as vital tools in multiple domains. For artists in the music industry, they provide structure, marketing clarity, and a framework for recognition. For listeners and communities, they offer identity, social cohesion, and connection. And cognitively, they help people navigate and interpret the immense, ever-expanding landscape of music. Genres have evolved from these rigid, prescriptive categories into flexible, multidimensional tools, and while their role has shifted in the modern musical ecosystem, they do remain deeply relevant. In many ways, genres matter differently today, I would say. They're no longer the definitive lens through which we understand music, but they remain this indispensable part of how music is created, experienced, and understood. Now, just to finish up, as we think about the evolution of music genres, I think it's impossible to not wonder what the future holds. With streaming, globalization, and technological innovation reshaping how we create, distribute, and consume music, the next 5 to 10 years could look dramatically different from the rigid, genre-defined world of the past. Genres that once served as clear, almost prescriptive categories are now becoming far more fluid and, like we've explored, in some cases they're almost irrelevant to the listening experience. Now, one possibility is, of course, that traditional genres could disappear entirely, or at least lose their power as strict labels. Now, we could argue that this is already happening today. Today's listeners are increasingly guided by mood, context, and personal taste rather than formal classifications. And in this scenario, genres may remain useful primarily as maybe more historical reference points, helping us trace the evolution of music, but less as active descriptors of what people are actually listening to in the moment. I think that music discovery will feel increasingly intuitive, adaptive, and individualized. Now, at the same time, AI-generated music is kind of posed to radically transform genres as we know them. Now, before I get blasted, I want to be clear. I do not support AI music as a replacement for human creativity. As a musician myself, I completely understand how it's attempting to, and likely will, disrupt the industry, potentially in ways that undermine human artistry. Yet AI is already capable of creating songs in multiple styles simultaneously, or inventing entirely new sonic textures that don't fit into conventional categories. So imagine a track blending synthwave, reggaeton, orchestral music, and electronic, all generated by AI, potentially becoming a viral hit. And these hybrid creations could force the industry, critics, and listeners to develop new ways of describing and understanding music, potentially rendering traditional genres obsolete for certain types of tracks. Now, I may not love this possibility, but it is happening, and it's largely beyond our control. Reflecting on its influence, I think, is super critical if we want to understand how industry trends, consumption habits, and creative practices may be shifting due to AI in the near future. I think streaming platforms will also evolve in step. So instead of shelving songs under outdated labels, platforms may introduce dynamic systems that are built around emotions, energy levels, or user-generated tags that shift in real time with cultural trends. Listeners will continue to define their taste less by what this genre is and more by how this makes me feel, pushing the center of music organization into this kind of realm of lived experience. And yeah, as someone who used to work at Spotify and is super interested in the streaming industry in general, I'm really curious to see what this shift may look like. I think we're already observing it. We are seeing such a dynamic shift in the way that quote unquote genres are presented outwardly to audiences, and particularly catering for virality and things like that. But yeah, I'm really interested to see a new kind of classification system. But overall, I would say I think genres are unlikely to vanish completely. In the future, they may become the anchor points of subcultures. So these sites of identity, community, and shared history. So all of these different communities, I think they'll continue to preserve the cultural weight of genre. So not as universal categories, but as deeply meaningful social identities. So, in other words, genre may lose its mainstream dominance, but live on as a kind of cultural compass for those who choose to carry it forward. Ultimately, the story of genres is not about disappearance, it's about evolution. Genres are no longer these rigid boxes, but they're flexible frameworks, tools that help us understand, organize, and emotionally connect with music. Whether they continue to serve as a guide, a cultural marker, or a point of identity, genres will remain an essential part of the musical ecosystem, even as the sounds themselves become more borderless, hybrid, and experimental. As listeners, we may increasingly interact with music through mood, activity, or personal resonance, but I think just knowing the history, psychology, and cultural significance of genres really gives us a richer appreciation of the songs that we love. So overall, I would say that genres may be evolving, but their influence is far from gone. And that brings us to the end of today's episode. Now, are you someone who's drawn to certain genres, or do you choose music based on mood, vibe, or context? Maybe have a think about how the way that you categorize, or maybe don't categorize music, shapes your experience and connection to it. I'd be really interested to hear your reflections as always. So get in touch with me on Instagram or Threads at the Soundmind Talks. We've got such an amazing community over there, so I'd really love if you join and come and say hi. But thank you so much for joining me today on The Sound Mind. If you've enjoyed this episode, please rate or review on wherever you're listening and share it with someone who loves music just as much as you do. Don't forget to follow us and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. But until next time, keep listening, keep reflecting, and I'll see you on The Sound Mind.